You're listening to Soundside. I'm Libby Dankman. For years, Seattle residents have known that several city police officers attended the Stop the Steal rally in Washington, D.C. on January 6, 2021. But the names of most of these police officers were unknown until recently. After a lengthy court fight, the city in late July disclosed the identities of all the officers who attended the rally. The city also released records from an investigation of the officers' role in the rally. Reporter Amy Radel has been combing through these documents, and she's here with new details. Amy, thanks for being back on Soundside.
Hi, thanks.
So I understand that none of these officers disputes that they attended the Stop the Steal rally. But who are these 6 SPD officers? Some current, some former.
Right. Yeah. And these are officers who all say that they used their vacation time to go to D.C. They met up with some former SPD officers, some other people with no connection to SPD. There were kind of like 2 different friend groups that emerged in these questions with the investigators. There was a married couple, Alexander Everett and his wife, Caitlin Rochelle Everett. They were with Officer Jason Marchian and also Sergeant Scotty Bach. So that was kind of like one clique, one group. And then there was also Sergeant Jacob Brisky with Detective Michael Settle. They were also traveling to D.C. and that day.
So there was like a group of 4 and then a group of 2. It's been 4 years since the rally and the attack on the Capitol. Can you remind us, why did it take so long for these names to come out?
Because of all the litigation surrounding this. You know, we've known the outlines of this investigation for a long time. Since 2021, the findings came out. So we knew, okay, 2 officers have been fired. 4 others were not found to have violated any policies. But we didn't know who they were. It all said employee 1, employee 2, and so you couldn't link up. And then the names, kind of got leaked and were kind of floating around. But again, we still didn't know who says that they did what that day, So that was interesting to me to finally be able to match them up and get the full account in the investigation.
Yeah, and the Everetts, the married couple, had been fired. Those had been reported publicly. So 2 out of the 6, now we have all 6.
Exactly. And, talking about the litigation, I mean, so the officers actually sued to keep their names from being disclosed and to be able to have a lawsuit where they used the pseudonyms in court, in the court documents. And this lawsuit made its way all the way to the Washington Supreme Court, where they said officers don't have a right to privacy. They can't sue under pseudonyms. Then they appealed that to the Supreme Court, asked them to put the state Supreme Court decision on hold. The U.S. Supreme Court declined to do that. So over these 4 years, that's the arc of all these lawsuits.
I do want to step back here, Amy, because your reporting notes that these are people who were confirmed to have attended the Stop the Steal rally that's at the Ellipse near the White House. That's not necessarily the insurrection at the Capitol. And that is, of course, the attack where 4 people in the crowd died. Several police officers were injured and some later died. And I bet many listeners are like, Stop the Steal versus insurrection, like there's not much of a difference between those 2 events. But it does sound like the officers and the OPA investigators, they certainly made a distinction. What could the Office of Police Accountability investigators confirm about these Seattle police officers' whereabouts on January 6th in D.C.?
Yeah, and this was a huge distinction. I mean, everyone in the investigators and the officers and the union representatives seemed, agreed that going to a rally is a First Amendment right as a peaceful attendee at
protected
something
speech.
Like that. Exactly. And then what the question was, so then Trump ended his speech by saying, let's walk to the Capitol, where the Electoral College votes were being certified. And who walked to the Capitol and how close did they get and what did they do? That was the focus. This was the crux of the investigation. So the investigators with the Office of Police Accountability, which is the independent office within SPD that investigates complaints of misconduct, they were asking the officers, they were showing them maps of the streets of Washington, D.C. and saying, okay, where did you go? What street did you walk on? Which way did you, which direction? Over and over. They obtained receipts from where the officers said that they went to eat. They looked at key card data from their hotels for when they said they went back to their hotels, things like that. So all the officers said they were out and about during Trump's speech on the Ellipse, walking around the monuments. Some of them said they just spent, maybe several minutes at the speech, but they all, pretty much were out in public for that that part of the day. And then the questions were about, what happened next. 3 officers admitted to walking towards the Capitol and standing on the grass around the Capitol. They said that they didn't go through into any restricted areas that they could see. And then 2 of the other officers were last seen on a street, kind of leading to the Capitol. But then they say they turned the other way as a big stream of Proud Boys broke through some barricades to storm the Capitol. Truly the riot taking place at that point.
So they saw that developing, but they say they didn't follow, or they turned around, basically.
And this was Sergeant Brisky. He actually said, I didn't like the look of that crowd as a police officer. I didn't want to get mixed up in that. So it's kind of like I made a conscious decision to go the other way. And then, one officer said, oh, yeah, I listened to a few minutes of Trump's speech. And then he said he went to his hotel room. So investigators ultimately found video evidence of 4 of the officers because, there were all these people rolling video throughout the day.
This thing was very well documented.
Yeah, it created a huge trove of video. And I think for law enforcement, the main thing was, someone having to go through it and look for. And so they did document 4 of the officers' whereabouts at one moment that afternoon. And then they were able to give that back to the investigators.
So let's focus first on the story of Caitlin Rochelle and Alexander Everett. They are a married couple. They're no longer employed by SPD. They were fired in August of 2021. So what happened with this married couple after January 6th?
This couple, they're the ones who admitted being closest to the Capitol that day. But they said to investigators that they saw nothing amiss. They said, we saw people singing and waving flags. Investigators tried to, drill down on these accounts because the Capitol Police said if you were there and you had a law enforcement background, you would have known that something was wrong that afternoon. Other people around the Capitol could hear explosions coming from inside the building. They could smell tear gas. So after these 2 officers had been interviewed, then the FBI gave the Seattle investigators video footage of the Everetts that showed exactly where they were. People were scaling the walls of the Capitol right behind them, not something that they disclosed to investigators.
In the interview, they had said, we had no idea anything was going on.
We saw people standing, that was the extent of it.
Yeah.
And so this video kind of shows a shot clearly of them, and then it turns and you see the people climbing the walls of the Capitol right there. And it's not conclusive, but the video even suggests that Alex Everett himself said he was thinking about following them. It's a voice that's off camera. It might be him speaking. It's not totally clear.
He's being talked to in the video, right? And then the video pans and you hear the voice saying, thinking about it, talking about going and act, going inside the Capitol.
Yep, exactly. And so, OPA said this evidence directly contradicts their accounts. So at that point, they were fired, and the city actually sustained findings of dishonesty against them even after they had been fired. They completed that investigation.
And so this is the married couple. They were fired in 2021. What was actually the grounds for firing them back then, Amy?
Yeah, they were fired for appearing to have broken D.C. law by trespassing. They violated SPD policies on professionalism by doing things that could undermine the public trust. And then ultimately there were findings of dishonesty, but that was actually after they were already gone.
So let's turn to a couple of these officers whose names had not been publicly released until now. Officer Jason Marchion and Sergeant Jacob Brisky. What did the investigation from the Office of Police Accountability conclude about them, Amy?
Yeah, and these are the 2 out of the 6 officers who still work at SPD. And they were exonerated in this investigation. The allegations against them of violating SPD policies on professionalism were deemed unsupported by the evidence. Officer Jason Marchion was actually dropped from the investigation sooner than the others. He was only interviewed one time, and they said that they felt like they didn't have grounds to need to interview him again. And here's how he described his day.
At 11 a.m., I was walking around the area of the Vietnam Memorial, the Washington Monument, and the Lincoln Memorial. That took me to probably around 11:45 or around 12 o'clock. There was a political rally at that time. The president at the time got on and prepared to speak at around 11:50 to 12. I left that area within about 2 to 5 minutes of him speaking, as I was very hungry, cold, and pretty much done with that part of my day. I went to Chipotle, left the area, went to Chipotle, got some food, went back to my hotel room where I took a nap and hung out.
So he said he was in his hotel room the whole afternoon.
So at this point, we have one of the current officers on SPD saying, he was at the political rally and that's something that's protected speech, but, headed back, was chilling out, didn't participate in the attack on the Capitol. What about the other officer who's currently employed at SPD, and that is Sergeant Brisky?
Yeah, so he was in D.C. with a colleague, Detective Michael Settle, and also a former SPD officer named Adley Shepard. And they told investigators that Shepard had a friend who owned a pub in D.C. And they said after seeing that stream of Proud Boys go by towards the Capitol, they turned the other way. They went over to this friend's pub. They didn't want to get mixed up in whatever was going on. And then the investigators actually went to D.C. and interviewed the bartender at the pub.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and she said that she, seemed to identify Brisky and Settle and Shepard not by name, but she, saw people who matched their descriptions, she said spent the afternoon there in the bar. And she remembered other people, being kind of surprised by that.
I remember people kept trying to approach them and talk to them, how did you guys, how are you able to sit in here? And I remember one of them being because we're being respectful, dude.
And the bartender said these three men sort of helped defend the bar because it sounds like there was a really charged atmosphere in the streets, and the bar closed early that day.
It can be hard, I think, for somebody to believe, at least an observer, that these officers say they were unaware of the violent attack on the Capitol, especially given the case of, say, Caitlin Rochelle and Alexander Everett. They had said they didn't know anything wrong, but it seems clear that in video and photo evidence that they did. I mean, how did the Office of Police Accountability view the officers' assertions that they didn't know, these other officers, that there was a violent attack happening at the Capitol, that they had been a part of the rally that then, went on to attack the Capitol?
Yeah, I mean, listening to these recordings, to me, they are bringing some skepticism to these questions.
The investigators
for OPA, for sure. And kind of taking another run at a lot of questions and especially because these officers are fresh off policing the protests in Seattle in 2020. I mean, I think, several of them mention they have a lot of experience with protests. So the fact that then they're at the Capitol and these things are happening and, they say, oh, we didn't see anything, any wrongdoing around us at all. That's what Caitlin Rochelle, Alex Everett, and Sergeant Scotty Bach all said, that they only realized that there was a problem when they saw an emergency alert on their phones. It was kind of like an Amber Alert. Everyone's phones sounded just before 3 p.m. that day, declaring a curfew. And Scotty Bach said at that point he went to his hotel and he said he watched in horror what had been happening that day. Alex Everett's reaction was a little less than that. He said his reaction when he saw the footage on the news was, "What the heck?" Those were his words. And OPA investigators said they don't really know whether Scotty Bach walked on the Capitol grounds. They had no video of him. They couldn't verify his movements. He said he walked on some grass, but he never passed through anything that said it was restricted.
And can you remind me, Scotty Bach, is he still employed with SPD?
No, he's not.
Okay.
Yeah, he's not.
And was that just a choice that he made to leave?
Yeah, I don't. I just know he's not employed, and he was not disciplined at all. They just said that the investigation in his particular case, they called it inconclusive. They just don't quite know his movements that day. And then obviously with the Everetts, their accounts were contradicted by the video evidence, so then they were fired for trespassing.
How active has the police union been in defending these officers, Amy? Because this certainly seems like an issue that they would take very seriously, protecting the perceived right to free speech here for these officers, these members of SPOG, the Police Officers Guild. Yeah, and in these recordings, there's a Seattle Police Officers Guild representative in with the officer every time they're questioned by the OPA. Sometimes they chime in with concerns over a specific question, and at the beginning of each interview, the SPOG representative kind of describes their overall concerns with the investigation. So I would say that they were pretty vehement in their, objections and their defense of the officers.
Before Alex Everett's interview, I heard Officer Derek Norton, as that Guild representative, tell investigators that the Guild was concerned that officers were being investigated simply for having unpopular political views in a Democratic city.
SPOG is concerned that this investigation could be then designed to retaliate against officers who do not hold the same majority political views of the citizens of Seattle, and that this investigation could discourage, intimidate, or encourage officers into not feeling free to exercise their political freedoms.
Yeah, and the investigators said they agreed police had the right to attend Trump's rally and have political beliefs, and they were trying to balance that right with these policies about not damaging public trust and, of course, with following the law.
So I want to zero in on that idea of public trust, Amy, because I imagine that people here in Seattle, maybe people who have protested, police reform advocates, many others would say they also have the same concerns. I mean, 6 officers went to a rally in support of a president that has an anti-immigrant agenda, that has shown sympathy for white supremacist groups, that has endorsed the idea of police violence just recently, saying that if an officer gets spit on, that they should hit back. Has this investigation raised concerns about these SPD officers who are still on the force's ability to work in this community?
I think at the time, I mean, what I sensed from people in the city was when this investigation came to light, a lot of people in Seattle felt betrayed because we even had the approximate statistic that we may have had the most officers from any single agency who confirmed going to D.C. on January 6th, and people here feeling like, wow, that's really at odds with how voters here vote. What kind of chasm does this show between residents and police here in Seattle? I talked to someone close to this on Background who said, that stat is, we don't know. There could be agencies that just never asked their officers, what did you do on January 6th? Seattle asked that question. So that was their perspective. But these concerns were also a big driver for Sam Suioka. He's the lawyer who has been, leading the legal fight to get these records. Here's his statement. He said, "When I initially filed this request 4.5 years ago, my main concern was for my community members in Seattle that are disproportionately surveilled and policed by SPD, that is Black, Brown, Native, queer, and immigrant communities. The public should always have a right to know who's policing them. That right is even more important as we see every day dozens of videos of masked, anonymous federal law enforcement officers taking people off the streets." And then Suioka was actually himself arrested for trespassing this past May when dozens of protesters broke into a building and vandalized it at the University of Washington. And that was over a protest calling on the university to sever ties with Boeing because of Israel's war in Gaza.
Amy, I think that the attack on the Capitol and all of these events that we're talking about here that happened on January 6th, that can feel far away because President Trump is back in office. He was reelected in 2024. Does the release of these names and records tell you anything about how the attack thousands of miles away will be remembered around the country?
Yeah, I think it's just a reminder. It's like a time capsule, right, of how we've kind of gone through the looking glass in terms of what happened on January 6, 2021. As I was reading these investigation documents, I was thinking the FBI staffers who supplied the video of the Everetts, they themselves have probably faced retaliation now under the Trump administration, as has, a lot of federal employees who participated in this investigation.
Yeah, a lot of people in the Justice Department have been fired if they were involved at all in, these prosecutions and these investigations.
Exactly. So that's how much the landscape has changed. So I just think this investigation shows how fast the political pendulum is swinging these days.
That's KUOW's Amy Radel, who's been talking about these new details in documents released as part of the release of names of 6 SPD officers, Seattle police, who attended January 6th. Amy, I really appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And before we go, Mayor Bruce Harrell's office did send KUOW a statement about these disclosures. It reads, in part, "Our office appreciates that the investigation is now public and the transparency it brings to this matter. Thanks for listening to Soundside. And hey, this show is only possible because listeners support us. If you are able to give right now, check out the show notes for a link to donate. And don't forget, you can listen live on KUOW 94.9 FM Seattle at noon and 8 p.m., Monday through Thursday, or anytime online at KUOW.org.